All right. So I know that not everyone makes it every time. We're going to do a bit of review about the whole book. The last 5 weeks, we've been talking about Abraham. Zooming out to look at the whole picture, does anybody remember what the Toledot are? We've talked about them a few different times.
What are?
The Toledot. I've mentioned them several times, but I've only explained them once or twice. The Toledot are, it's the Hebrew phrase for generations. The book of Genesis is organized into 10 Toledot phrases. The phrase Ele Toledot, these are the generations. That phrase occurs 10 different times in the book. Actually 11 times, because one of them is repeated. If you're looking for structural clues, you're trying to figure out how is this book organized, this is one of the biggest, most obvious clues. Every section, except for the prologue, begins with the phrase, these are the generations of such and such. We've got enough people here, more than 10 I think, that if everyone remembers one, we can remember all of them. So, anybody remember one? Adam, yes. This is the book of the generations of Adam. It's the only one that says book. That's the second one.
Noah.
Who?
Noah.
Noah. Yes. Noah is one of them. We'll get to him when I remember the order.
Abraham.
No.
No? What? I thought that was the safe one.
I can see why you would think that. But no.
Are you going to say Abram?
No, actually,
Okay.
Terah.
going to say it's Abram.
Terah is the centerpiece. You have 5 on either side of them. It's deliberately made to be 5 by giving Esau twice. Esau twice in a row in like the same paragraph. So that you have 11 total. So that Terah, which is the story of Abraham, but he's Abraham's father, you have right in the middle. Noah you have here.
God?
No. Though that's close. There's one at the very beginning.
Yeah.
That it's in 2:4, I believe, if you're looking for it.
Man?
Man. Well, Adam is the word man, so sort of. Ham. Yes. Noah and his sons is one of them. Noah and sons. And then it specifies Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So yes, Ham is one of them.
Cain?
Cain. I don't believe it uses the word, these are the generations. But let me just check to be sure. It would be Genesis 4 if we had it. Seth. That one we do have. These are the generations of Seth. We just need 3 more.
My wife is trying to look for the answers to me.
She just wants you to take a fall if she's wrong.
She gave me Abraham.
I was trying the same thing here, but it didn't.
Noah. Actually, Seth is wrong. I'm sorry. We get Shem later. So these are the ones we've covered so far. So this is bonus if you can get these ones. We haven't covered them yet.
What's number 1?
Good question.
Jacob.
Jacob is, in fact, the last one. Number 1 is the heavens and the earth.
Heavens and the that's
Only 2 more.
That's a genealogy?
Well, that's what it says. It's not really a genealogy.
Isaac.
Yep. We've only got 1 more, and I'll give you a hint. This is the one we're talking about today. That's not a hint because I didn't tell you what we were talking about today.
That's a bad hint.
I know.
Ishmael.
Ishmael. Absolutely. So these are the 11 Toledot, the heavens and the earth, Adam, Noah and his sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Shem specifically, because Shem is where you get the line of Abram. Shem actually means name. And God tells Abram, I will make you a great name. Others try to make a great name for themselves, like Nimrod, and he's a mighty hunter before the Lord. They build a great big tower in Babel, or at least they start. If the archaeological remains we have are the right ones, they didn't get very far at all, like 1 or 2 layers tops. But God comes down, he stops them. They try to make a name for themselves, but God makes a name for Abraham. And God gives Jesus. He gives it to him, the name that is above every other name. Then you get Terah, the story of Abram. Then we get to Ishmael. That's where we'll be today. Now you'll notice, and as Pastor Dan pointed out, you would have expected Abraham. There's another guy you would have really expected. How many chapters are there about Adam? Not very many, right? It's only like 2. It's mentioned in 3, maybe 4 if you really stretch it. How many chapters are there about Joseph? Quite a few. All the way from 37 to the end of the book, 13 chapters about Joseph. And yet you don't have... And how many chapters are there about Abraham? Again, many. But you don't have the generations of Abraham, and you don't have the generations of Joseph. What you do have is their fathers, Terah and Jacob. It's a very family-oriented book. You learn about people through their sons. So today we'll be talking about Ishmael. Some of these, they do talk about the person with the name in the phrase. Like with the generations of Adam, it is about Adam. Same with Noah. It is about Noah. With Ishmael, I want to pause in our progression through the book to go back to Ishmael. Ishmael is right in the middle of the Abraham story for everything that you read about him. Ishmael is a picture both of God's blessing and of God's rejection. I want to look at those 2 things today. We're going to look at how Ishmael is a picture of God's blessing, the blessing to Abraham, and the blessing to Gentiles. And then we'll look at how he's a picture of rejection, because God chooses Isaac and not Ishmael. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 16. 16:1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant, it may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. You'll notice already, if you're paying attention, there's words that are repeated. Often when you're reading the Bible, especially a narrative, if you're looking to figure out what the author wants you to notice, he'll say it several times. So far we've seen twice already that Hagar is an Egyptian. It would be sufficient to say it once, except that he's trying to emphasize it. And we see that she's given. And we see that she's a servant. That's been repeated as well. I was going to overview this, but when nobody remembered Ishmael up there, I thought we should go over the story a little closer. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Again, emphasizing the language of servant, because he's her mistress. That's a female word for master there. May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. That's the second time we've seen contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her. It's linked to contempt. And she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, Return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring, so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are pregnant, you shall bear a son, you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord had listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, You are a God of seeing. For she said, Truly, here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So notice those things: servant, submission, enmity or contempt. This language of her being an Egyptian. Why would you emphasize her being an Egyptian? I've tried the last several weeks to emphasize that when you are reading the Bible, often stories are meant to be compared with each other. They are given with specific details. Often those details are repeated to link you to other stories. Where else in the book of Genesis do you see Egyptian submitting to the Hebrew? The Egyptian being a slave given to the Hebrew or given by a Hebrew. Where else do you see the Hebrews or the Egyptians being told to submit to a Hebrew? Any ideas? Sticking within the book of Genesis. Where you see an Egyptian a slave. Thought I heard an answer somewhere. It's not quite in Genesis. In the story of Joseph. But there's a major difference. It's not one Egyptian, it's every single Egyptian in Egypt. Hagar here is a picture of her people. When Joseph goes to Egypt, he speaks harshly. Egypt is in distress. Egypt is as good as dead. They're going to die unless they get a lot of food because there's 7 years of famine that come on the land. There's only one way to escape and be saved. You have to submit to Joseph, the Hebrew. Is there enmity between the Hebrews and the Egyptians? Absolutely. When Joseph's brothers come with their father, Joseph has to warn them, be careful talking about your job. Shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians, and they're all shepherds. The Hebrew people are an abomination to the Egyptians. And yet, if the Egyptians are to receive salvation here, they must submit to this harsh speaker. This one who tells them they must sell everything they have. Remember when the famine comes first, they all buy grain from him. But soon their money runs out, and the famine keeps going. They sell all that they have to buy more grain from him. Then they have nothing left. They sell their land, and they even go to the point of selling themselves. And they say, we will be servants or slaves. Evet, same Hebrew word. We will be slaves to you. Give us grain. And they sell themselves as slaves. And the Hebrew gives the slaves to Pharaoh. Joseph gives the Egyptians to Pharaoh as a gift. All of them. All of Egypt is your slave now, Pharaoh. They have to submit to the one that they hate. Joseph's brothers have to do the same, don't they? They've shown that they hate their brother. There's lots of enmity between them. They throw him into the pit. They see him coming. He hasn't even done anything. They already hate him. They hear his dreams and they're jealous. Is there jealousy in this story? When she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Jealousy is all throughout this story. Joseph's brothers are jealous of him, and so they hate him, and so they try to kill him. But in the end, when there's no water, the only way they can be saved is to submit to the one who speaks harshly. How does he speak harshly? What does he say? He tells them, one of you stole from me. Where's my silver cup, which I drink from? Check their bags. He tells them, I'll imprison all of you. Send one of you to go back and get your father. He's a little merciful, sure. He says, I'll only imprison the oldest, except he doesn't go for the oldest because he hears things from the oldest. Judah would be the one he'd imprison, right? If he's imprisoning the oldest. But he hears them. They don't know he can hear them because they're speaking Hebrew, and he has a translator. He understands Hebrew, but he has a translator stand there, so they don't know he understands Hebrew. And he hears Judah saying, "Did I not tell you not to harm the boy?" And so he goes for the second oldest. He puts Simeon in prison. He's harsh to them, and he says, "You are spies. You have come to spy out this land." And until they submit to this one who is harsh to them, just like they did in the vision, just as God had promised to Joseph. Remember the vision? They all bow down in a circle. It's sheaves around one sheaf, and all the sheaves bow down to Joseph's sheaves. Or, again, all the stars bowing down to him in the other dream. They have to submit to the one that they hate, the one who is harsh to them. Maybe by now you can see where I'm going with this. That this is all quite deliberately a picture of the gospel. The story of Hagar submitting to Sarai is the gospel in a nutshell. This Gentile, this Egyptian, can be saved, can be given great blessing for Abraham's sake when she submits to this Hebrew whom she hates. Jesus was probably the most hated Hebrew in the world. He was hated by his own. He came to his own, and his own received him not. And he's hated all around the world. The Jews are hated all around the world. For people older than me, the Holocaust is still something we remember. And they didn't all die in Germany. They died all over Europe. They were hated. And to be saved today, you need to submit to a Hebrew named Jesus. The one who's hated by all the world. The one who speaks harshly. Does he speak harshly to his own people? Anyone give me an example of Jesus speaking harshly? Or is everything he says nice?
Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites.
Absolutely. Woe unto you, brood of vipers. Who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Remember the Syrophoenician woman? It's not fitting to take the bread that belongs to the children and give it to the dogs. That's harsh. Can you imagine if you went to Jesus and he said, "You dog, bye." Jesus is filled with harsh words. Often, he speaks about hell more than anyone else in the Bible. He talks about the place with weeping and gnashing of teeth. But like Joseph, his harshness conceals his love. Do you remember that when Joseph was harsh, at the same moment, it was so clear to the readers, though the brothers couldn't see it, that he loved his brothers in his heart. He was harsh, but he didn't hate them. He had no grudge against them. Leviticus 19, the middle of the middle book of the Torah. It says, "Do not hate your brother in your heart, and don't bear a grudge against him." Joseph fulfills it perfectly. And you can see it because when he's harsh with his brothers, he has to leave the room and go cry where they can't see him. When he hears that Judah didn't want to kill him, he has to cry. He loves them. And even his harshness is because he loves them. He wants to see that they've changed. When they betrayed him, when they threw him in the pit, it was because they hated it was perceived as a hatred of their father. And now he wants to see, have you changed your ways? Do you love the Father now? Well, let's repeat this whole thing. What did you do to me? The only son of Rachel. You threw me in a pit and tried to kill me. I'm going to give you the opportunity again. Let's have the only son of Rachel. Come over here, Benjamin. And I'm going to set him up so you can let him die. I'll do all the work for you. I've set him up so he looks like he stole from me. He deserves to die. You guys are jealous of him, and I know it like you were of me. I'm going to give you the opportunity to just let him die. Let's see if you'll do it again or if you've changed. His harshness is because he loves them. He wants to see that they've changed. And as soon as he sees it, he blesses them more than they could have ever hoped. He gives them the land of Goshen, right? Jesus' harshness is like this. Even with the Pharisees, he's harsh with them. He says, woe to you. He starts out pleading, he's explaining, he tries to argue with them, and then when they just won't listen to reason, then he begins to denounce them. And when denouncing doesn't work, he goes up to the mountain and he cries when they're not looking. He says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wish I could have gathered you, as a mother hen gathers her chicks, but you were not willing. When he says, I wish, that's the same word, willing. I was willing, but you were not willing. He shows his love for them when he cries. Jesus has been appointed judge of the world. Paul talks about this often. The wrath of God has been revealed against all unrighteousness and ungodliness of men, who in their unrighteousness suppress the truth. When he shares the gospel in Gentile cities, he says that God overlooked your ignorance in former times, this is in Acts 17, but now he has commanded all people everywhere to repent. It's the same message Peter gives at Pentecost. God has made him both Lord and Christ whom you have crucified, therefore repent. Because Jesus has been made judge of the world and he's coming in judgment. That's harsh. That's a harsh message that we as Christians bring into the world. But to be saved, we have to submit to the one who's harsh. And when we do, we see his love. Once Joseph's brothers change their ways and they show their changed heart, Joseph doesn't hide his tears anymore. He cries right in front of them. He hugs them. He kisses them on the neck. I guess that's what they did back then. This is what it's like with Jesus. He hides his tears. He loves. And when we submit to the one who's harsh, whom we naturally hate because we're by nature children of wrath, then we see his love. And we see it more and more and more as Paul prays that we would know the unknowable love of God. So 2 things I want to take away from this quickly. One is that we do have to submit to the one who is harsh. That this story we see of Hagar being told to submit to the one who is harsh, that is a demonstration of faith. You have to be pretty harsh to scare a pregnant lady away. Most pregnant ladies would not run into the wilderness without water. But because she believes the promise given to her by the angel, she is willing to do it anyway. She's willing to go back and submit to Sarah, despite the harshness. In this life, if we submit to Jesus, we are picking up our cross and following him. He says, in this life you will have troubles. In this world you will have troubles. But take heart, I have overcome the world. If you believe that he's overcome the world, you will be willing to endure the troubles. And because she believes the promise, God tells her, I will make you a great nation. Though you're not the chosen nation, because of my love for Abraham, I will make you a great nation. God's not trying to be fair. He doesn't do this for every lady who ever lived. This is because Abraham loves this child. Because she believes the promise, she's willing to submit. And if we believe God's promises, we will submit to Jesus, even through hardships. Even when his will seems like something we don't like. Even when he tells you, no, there's something you want, and he says no. You have your way that you want, well, he has his way. We believe his promises, we believe that his way is better. The second thing I want to take away from this story is that there is a time to be harsh. This probably isn't the time. I don't see anything in the text that says Sarai is justified in being harsh. But Jesus was. In Canada, maybe this is just me, but I'm pretty sure it's a Canadian thing, our tendency is never to be harsh. We would like to share the gospel in a way that we never offend anybody. We only share it with people that it won't offend. That's going to be really difficult because the gospel is offensive. There's no you can be as nice as you want, but you cannot come up to somebody and say, unless you repent, God will punish you in hell for eternity. There's just no nice way to say that. Jesus is harsh because he's loving. Now, I know there are Christians who are harsh because they're not loving. And they give harshness a bad name. But Jesus is our example. So let's imitate him. All right, I said we were going to look at how Ishmael is both a picture of blessing to the Gentiles and a picture of rejection. Does anyone have any questions on what we've gone over so far? I know we were all over the place.
The question I have is, fit in here, but why did Joseph end up making the entire Egyptian population a slave of Pharaoh? In other words, he changed it from maybe, I don't know what you would call it, to an absolutely totalitarian.
Yeah.
Was that revenge?
I don't believe so. I believe it's he is a good servant of Pharaoh. Pharaoh is blessed through Abraham's offspring. God promised Abraham, I will make you a blessing to all nations. And that happens through Joseph. Joseph is a blessing to all the Egyptians because he saves them from the famine. He's a blessing especially to Pharaoh by giving him the nation. I don't get the impression that, how to put it, it was harsher than God's law by double, you could say. He taxed them a fifth, God only taxed a tenth. But I don't see any condemnation in the text of Joseph's decision. The Bible paints Joseph in a very favorable light for everything he does. What I would say is that it's a wonderful picture. And we'll talk more about this as we get to Joseph. But Joseph is hated by his brothers. They want to kill him. They throw him into the pit. They tear his garments and they sell him to the Gentiles for the price of a slave in shekels of silver. I hope you see where I'm going with this. God raises him up to the right hand of power and makes him a blessing. And when his rule is complete, he takes all things and he puts them under the king. What does it say in 1 Corinthians 15? Let's turn there. I hope you see where I'm going. But these things that happen to Joseph are clear pictures of what happens to Jesus. Jesus is hated by his brothers. He comes to his own, and his own receive him not. They tear his garments. They sell him for the price of a slave, 30 shekels in silver. They sell him to the Gentiles who oppress him. He's raised up by God to the right hand of power and made a blessing to all nations, to the Gentiles first, right? Joseph has made a blessing to the Egyptians first, and it actually says to all the world. Then to his brothers, who did not recognize him at first. He came to his own, and his own received him not. But in the end, it says all Israel will be saved. 1 Corinthians 15. As you were all turning there, I wasn't, just so you know. Talking about the resurrection and the end of all things. If I can remember what part of it was in, I wasn't planning to go here today. Let's say verse 26. Verse 25. He must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. That's what Joseph does. Everything is put under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. For God has put all things in subjection under his feet. But when it says all things are put in subjection, it is plain that he is accepted who put all things in subjection under him. Joseph rules everything. Obviously, he doesn't rule Pharaoh. Pharaoh's the one who put him there. When all things are subjected to him, then the Son himself will also be subjected to him, who put all things in subjection under him, so that God might be all in all. In Daniel, it describes it this way, that after, when the end comes, the Son will put all things and give them the kingdom into the hand of the Father, which is what Joseph does. I don't know politically how that worked out. From my understanding of Egyptian history, it wasn't that bad as far as slavery goes. It wasn't like the slavery we had in America. They had a lot more vacation time. And it wasn't based in racism or anything like that. But what I do see is that the text makes it a picture of Jesus. That he is someone who has all things put under his feet by God. And then he puts it all under the one who subjected it to him. He gives it all back to Pharaoh, like Jesus will one day give all things to the Father. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes.
As for what Joseph was going through Joseph's mind, I don't know. I'll say one more thing on that. The text does not at any point tell us that Joseph sinned. That does not mean Joseph didn't sin. Joseph definitely sinned. But the story doesn't say a single bad thing about Joseph because it wants to make him the picture of Jesus. Joseph could have had bad motives there. Joseph could have been unwise in that decision. But the text doesn't emphasize it. And so as I'm deciding what I'm going to speak on, I try to always, and maybe I'm not perfect at this, but I try to emphasize the things that are actually in there. All right. Any other questions on Ishmael being a picture of God blessing the nations? You and I are blessed like Hagar here, who submits to the one who's harsh, to the Hebrew, that there's contempt between us. We are by nature children of wrath. We were his enemies when he died to save us. Ishmael is also a picture of rejection. We've talked a fair bit about election, or God choosing people. You see that he doesn't choose the line of Cain. He does choose the line of Seth. We see that he chooses Noah. We see that he chooses Abraham. Abraham's just an old man. I'm sure there were other old men in the world, but God comes to Abraham for reasons unknown to us and says, "Go from the land of your fathers, and I will make you a great nation." Could have said that to anyone. I mean, we would have thought he'd say it to Nimrod. Nimrod was a great, powerful ruler. If you're going to pick someone on the earth to be a great nation, you'd probably pick someone who had started a few big cities, like Babel or Akkad. But no, he went to this old man, whose name meant exalted father, and yet who had no kids. It was by grace. Ishmael is a picture, though, of someone who's not chosen. I want to talk about some of the motifs that surround chosen and not chosen. There are commonalities between many of the people in the Bible who are not chosen. One of them would be wandering in the wilderness. Cain is someone who's not chosen. And so God sends him east to the land of Nod, which means wandering. And he wanders around in the land of wandering and says, "I'm a wanderer and a fugitive on the earth. I'm a nod and a nod," in the Hebrew. On the Day of Atonement, there's an animal that is chosen for God. This lamb is taken into the tabernacle. It's slaughtered there, and it suffers. It's chosen for God. And there's one that isn't chosen for God. Does anyone know what happens to it? It's sent into the wilderness because it's not chosen. Ishmael. When it's clear that Isaac is the offspring. God says, through Isaac your offspring will be named. Sarah says, "Cast out this woman, this slave woman, and her son, for the son of the slave woman will not inherit with my son." And God says to Abram, "Do what your wife said." And she casts him into the wilderness. God still keeps his promise. He's told them, "I'll make them a great nation." But he says, "Cast them into the wilderness." Israel, when they disobey God, they refuse to fight giants, what happens to them? They wander in the wilderness. They looked like they were chosen, but they weren't. We see this in this story as well. Ishmael looked like he was chosen. God said, "I will multiply your offspring." Well, Ishmael's his offspring. God had not told him at that point that through Isaac your offspring will be named. He never said that it would be through Sarah. It seemed like Ishmael was the offspring. In fact, when God said to Abraham, through Isaac your offspring will be named, what did Abraham say? Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. I've already got a son. We see this with Esau as well. Isaac wanted Esau to be the heir of the promise. Jacob got it because he dressed up as Esau and tricked him. When Isaac pronounces the blessing on him, he believes that he's blessing Esau. Israel, when they came out of Egypt, looked like they were the chosen ones who would enter the promised land and be the inheritors of the promise. God gave them the covenant at Sinai, and it sure looked like they were the ones to inherit. But God sent them out into the wilderness because of their disobedience, because of their unbelief. And he went with the second. This is another thing we see often with God's choosing, that he chooses the second, or he chooses one in the place of another. He chooses Seth instead of Abel, in the place of Abel, because Cain killed him. He chooses Jacob instead of Esau. The older shall serve the younger. He chooses the second. He chooses Isaac instead of Ishmael. Again, the older serving the younger. Choosing the second. He often chooses shepherds and not warriors. Something these have in common is they all display God's power, not man's. If God chose the strong, the warriors, it would look like he was choosing for the sake of their virtue. But he chooses the weak. If he chose the one that Abram wanted him to choose, if he chose the one that Esau wanted him to choose, it would look like it was based on the will of man and not on the will of God. If he chose those who were according to the flesh, great. Or who were born according to the flesh. Ishmael is born, Paul says, according to the flesh. Isaac is born according to promise. It's not by the will of man, but by the will of God. This is what John talks about in John 1 when he says that God will give them the authority to be called children of God, those born not of man, nor of the will of man, of blood, but by the will of God, right? As you look at these stories, there's so much that they have in common with Esau, with Ishmael, with Israel in the wilderness. To me, these commonalities point to the sovereignty of God and the will of God, not the will of man. Now, that doesn't mean that God is bound by some kind of rules. It's not like he has to pick one and not the other. Now, God could have picked Jacob and Esau, both. Why not? When Jacob had 12 sons, how many of them did God pick? 12. And they were the worst of all the people in the Torah so far. Esau wanted to kill his brother and didn't really do anything, right? And God didn't choose him. Esau cared more about a bowl of stew than about the promise, and God rejected him because he despised the birthright. And yet, when you have Jacob's sons, who care nothing for their father, who care nothing for their brother, who throw their brother in a pit and sell him off into slavery, God picks all of them. He doesn't have to go with the second. He doesn't have to go with the weak. Paul says, not many of you were great or were wise in the world's standards. Not many of you were powerful. Not many of you were rich. Some of you were, though. Right? Otherwise, he wouldn't have to say not many. He could just say none. God's not bound by rules. He picked Paul. Paul was an amazing teacher. Paul was someone who was absolutely well respected in his community by all the Pharisees. God picked him. He's not bound by rules. But he tends to choose people who demonstrate that it is his choice. And you see that with Ishmael, even in the way that he is rejected. He's someone who goes into the wilderness. One of the ones that Paul picks up on is he's born according to the flesh in Galatians 4. Whereas Isaac is born according to according to the promise. Ishmael is one who is a slave. God picks one who is free. That one's a bit odd because God sets Israel free. God tends to pick the ones who are suffering. Do you see where I'm going with this? That when God chooses people, he usually does it in a way that we can see it's his choice. When you get to Jesus, he is born of a virgin. That's about the strongest way you could say, not born by the will of man. It's about the strongest way you could say, not born according to the flesh. He is born according to promise. He comes at the appointed time. He's someone who's weak on the cross. He's someone that had no form that we should look at him. He's chosen by God, and he is someone who's willing to suffer. And like Israel, who suffers for 400 years and then comes to glory, he suffers on the cross and then is exalted to glory. Let's turn to Galatians 4. I have 2 points I'm hoping you leave today with. One is that you have to submit to the one Hebrew whom is hated by the world. The other is that you should not submit to a yoke of slavery. And I hope you see that these patterns throughout the Bible of God choosing and rejecting, they have a consistency to them that you can see. God foreknew Israel's refusal to fight giants. He'd already foreshadowed it several times by sending Cain to the wilderness, by sending Ishmael to the wilderness, by sending the ram on the Day of Atonement into the wilderness. He gave them that law before they were sent into the wilderness. So they could see when they're sent into the wilderness, we understand. We were not the ones who were chosen by God. God chose the second generation to go in. He foresaw the Jewish nation rejecting Jesus. He knew beforehand that the brothers would reject Joseph, just as the nation would reject Jesus. And he destroyed their city and sent them into the wilderness. And he chooses instead to save a second generation yet to come. Galatians 4. Actually, go back to Galatians 3. We'll look at verse 29, just the last verse. If you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. Paul wants to talk about this heirs according to promise, not according to the flesh, so that you understand that you are an heir according to promise. Now, according to the flesh can mean, in the case of Ishmael, he was born according to the will of Abraham, by Abram's fleshy decisions. It can also just mean genetically. But not all who are heirs according to the flesh are heirs. Not all children of Abraham are considered the offspring of Abraham. See what I mean? Ishmael is descended from Abraham. That doesn't mean he gets the promise. Esau is descended from Abraham. That doesn't mean he gets the promise. The whole generation that dies in the wilderness is descended from Abraham, but that doesn't mean they get the promise. The Jews to this day are descended from Abraham, but if they don't repent and turn to Jesus, they will not get the promise. Because the promise was through faith. Not by genetics, not by work, but through faith. Just as Abraham received it by faith, so all of his children will. But Paul goes on. I mean that the heir, as long as he is a child, is no different from a slave, though he is the owner of everything, but he is under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. In the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth a Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. Because you were a son. Notice, he's talking about not just Gentiles, but Jews here. He came, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. The promise has come, not through the law, but through Jesus. Not through being descended from Abraham, but through Jesus. That's how we receive the adoption. And because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. We see in Ishmael and in Hagar. In Hagar, we see that we have to submit to this Hebrew. We have to submit to Jesus. Paul's going to say here that we should not submit to a yoke of slavery. We are saved and set free from all that we were slaves to. We're set free from sin. The Jews are set free from the law. To belong to another. To belong to Jesus. So don't go and submit to something else again. We belong to Jesus and not to another. There are, from time to time, people who will try to bring us into some yoke of slavery. There are going to be teachers who say, if you want to be really saved, well, you've got to start keeping Passover. You've got to get circumcised. You've got to start doing all these Jewish festivals. Or it might be something more Mennonite-ish. I had friends who grew up as Old Colony Mennonites, and they were just told, you've got to do a bunch of good works, and some of them were really bizarre. You've got to wear all black on your wedding day. You've got to not read the Bible in your own language. You can only read it in High German. Too bad you don't know High German. You're not allowed to pray. I had friends who got in trouble for reading the Bible and praying in their own rooms when they were caught. They were told they had to do all these random weird things. That's how they'd get salvation if they were lucky. But we receive the Spirit through faith. We receive the promise through faith, because God doesn't start something through faith and then need to perfect it through something lesser. So I don't know if any of you are tempted to submit to some yoke of slavery. If you have something that will get you closer to God, faith. But faith is the way that God has given us. So I'm going to conclude on that, unless someone has questions, because I do understand I was all over the place there. Submit to Jesus. He loves you, even when he seems harsh. Share the gospel because Jesus loves the world, even if it seems harsh. And as you do it, don't submit to a yoke of slavery. Don't be like Hagar, who wasn't chosen. She was a slave. God desired to have a people who were free. When he wanted to make Israel a great nation, he didn't say, all right, you're going to be the greatest nation of Egyptian slaves that ever was, and stay in Egypt. No, he brought them out. And Jesus is far greater than they were then. He wants us to be free, to be sons of God, to be led by the Spirit, not following him because we think we have to in this way or that way, because we're scared, because we love him. We imitate him as beloved sons, beloved children. I'm just going to pray for us. Lord, I know that my words are often foolish, that we stumble much in many ways. But Lord, I also know that it is just as we are saved not by our own efforts, not by our own will, not by our genealogies, but by your grace. so also we grow by your grace. So I ask that you would be gracious towards us today, that you would help us to grow closer to you, that we would trust you more as we see that you planned from the beginning to save those who were weak, that you planned from the beginning, that we were chosen before the foundation of the earth. I ask that we would grow in our trust as we see that Jesus was the plan A, there was no plan B. You could see him in the Old Testament scriptures. And I ask that we would have such a faith in your love, such a trust in things that we cannot see, that we would be willing to submit to every ordeal that you have before us, that we would count it a joy when we experience various trials, that we would know that the testing of our faith produces endurance, and that we would experience joy as we see your work in us. In Jesus' name.